Shalom to you all. Wonderful to see familiar faces and familiar names, and wonderful to have the first in a two-part series, two webinars dealing with a critical issue that's part of the larger picture of the challenges of equality and religion and state in Israel. And this time it has to do with gender separation, or as Professor Yofi Tirosh chose to title the session, sex segregation. And I know that she intends to explain to us why the choice was for that particular label, sex segregation. Be it as it may, the issue of gender or sex separation or segregation has been manifesting itself in a variety of ways over the years, and at, some may say, at a growing pace and growing severity. You'll hear a lot more about it from our speaker. This webinar, as those before it, is co-sponsored by Chidush, Ruach Chidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel. And it's wonderful to have both executive committee members and so many colleagues on this call. By JPLAN, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and it's wonderful to have members from the legal network as well. And the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. And this time, we are particularly pleased and proud to have another partner with a particular interest in the issue of gender equality, and that is the JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. And it's wonderful to have a longtime friend and the great activist, Daphne Price, the executive director of JOFA, and I assume a number of, yes, hello, Daphne. And I assume a number of members from this important organization. As a matter of fact, I'm discussing with Daphne the possibility, and we'll see whether there is enough interest generated to have a third session in which we will discuss the American scene, because in the first two sessions, we'll put the focus on the Israeli scene. So we could not have hoped for a better presenter for the topic than Professor Yofi Tirosh, who is Associate Professor at Tel Aviv University Law School, Research Fellow at the Hartman Institute, former Dean of the Paris Law School, the Sapir Law School. And if you look at the invitation, you'll see her most recent article dealing with 3 decades of sex segregation. And the question that we are discussing today is, where are we going, given the landmark ruling of the Israeli Supreme Court earlier this month? So we are in for a treat because Yofi is truly one of the leading activists, one of the proponents and the initiators of one of the 4 petitions that were pending before the Supreme Court. Some of the petitions, like that of Dr. Tirosh, was in order to eliminate segregation, and some of them were intending to get the Supreme Court to endorse segregation. All of that obviously is important in and of itself in terms of gender equality, but is also of particular importance because it's part of the overall religion and state conflict. And for the first half hour, we'll hear from Dr. Tirosh and see her presentation and be able to get a deeper sense of the complexity of the issue and the larger picture beyond this particular Supreme Court case. In 2 weeks, we'll host Professor Tova Hartman for a different perspective. And it's very important for us to be able to share with you different perspectives on the issue. And today, you will be able to hear and ask your questions on the chat and possibly ask your questions later. We'll try and get further responses from Dr. Tirosh, and the microphone and the camera is yours.
Thank you very much, Uri. I'm really pleased and honored to be here. And let me start sharing my presentation. Okay, I have, be forewarned, much more slides than my half hour, so this will be a little bit of a race. But as Uri said, this has been a really interesting month. A couple of weeks ago, the High Court of Justice ruled on a case that has been going through the pipelines since 2014. These are some of the partners in the case. You may recognize some of them, namely on the left, folks from the formerly known Center for Jewish Pluralism, and today the Reform Center, Orly Erez Lachovsky and others, ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, Israel Women's Network, folks, etc., etc. And in the very center, this handsome guy, if you see my my mouse, is Advocate Chagai Kalai, who has represented us pro bono all those years in a very, very complex petition. The ruling is part victory, part loss. It recognizes that sex segregation in academic studies infringes on sex equality and on the right to human dignity. And so it accepts our basic premise, which is sort of the Brown v. Board of Education premise, which is that the sexes cannot be equal when they are segregated in areas that are not relevant to sex difference. So we're not talking about a synagogue, and we're not talking about a swimming pool in public swimming. We're talking about an activity where the differences between males and females is irrelevant. But then the court didn't stop there. It found that there was a legitimate state interest in this segregation and moved on, as is the doctrine in Israeli constitutional law, to a proportionality analysis, which set important constraints on how these programs can and are allowed to operate. It found that today the infringement of equality is not proportional, most notably the ban on female professors to teach in male classrooms is illegal. And there are other areas of proportionality constraints that I will touch upon later. But as Uri said, I want to contextualize this petition and provide the backdrop of what's going on in Israel regarding sex segregation. And a point about why do I use sex and not gender? Of course, sex is the term that refers to the biological differences, be it genetic or morphological, and gender has to do with the social role, the way a person is perceived and behaves according to our association of what is a feminine performance or what is a masculine performance. This is just one example of how the religious order classifies people when we're talking about segregated spaces, not according to their gender performance, but according to their sex performance. So it's not about your biological sex, it's not about your gender, it's about your biological sex. That is what's going to determine to what side of the Western Wall you will be sent. And here is another somewhat amusing example. As you know, there are segregated buses in Israel where women sit at the back. This is a photo from last Purim where a woman wore a costume of a yeshiva student, but she still sat at the back, okay, as a woman. So even in her own logic, and she did pass as a man in Purim, she kind of complied by her original sex in terms of where she's supposed to sit. So a few minutes of background. How did we get to the reality that I want to share with you today, a reality in which norms of modesty requirements from women, expectations that they don't participate in some activities, or that they sit separately from men, or lower their voice, or not use their voice at all, are growing and are being normalized. How did we get here? As you all know, the ultra-Orthodox community, which is about 12 to 15%, depends on how you count, has been very secluded in most of the time in which Israel exists in the past 7 decades. But in the last few years, there are imminent very fundamental changes happening from within and from without. Very briefly, from within the community, there is a unpreventable exposure to the internet. Most Haredim own smartphones, and they are taboo and in secret, but they still own them, and they surf the web and they learn how the other side lives, mainly in Hebrew, because most of them do not speak or study English in school. And kind of the cultural fences are lowered a little bit. There's curiosity, there's willingness to see how the other side lives. Another transformation from within is that there is fatigue of life of poverty. There is a growing middle class that wants to participate in the consumption market and earn a decent living and have careers, etc., etc. And from the outside, there are important governmental efforts to encourage integration of Haredim, of ultra-Orthodox, into the Israeli labor market, into the military, into academic studies that are perceived as a vehicle for labor market participation. And these are, of course, appreciated efforts in my mind. The thing is that the way it has been done, it's been kind of performed, is by a very easy, quick fix, not debated or reflected upon solution, which is, in order to integrate Haredim, we will ask Israeli women, both religious and secular, to move aside and to cover themselves. And that is the dilemma that we're facing today. This slide shows Labour Party head Merav Michaeli being blurred, just to show you one aspect of it. I will return to it soon. This cartoon that I asked a neighbor to draw according to an idea that I had, it comes to demonstrate that the standards of modesty and of the appropriate depth and context of sex segregation are very dynamic and fluid. They're ever changing. And what we see today in Israel is this pendulum movement, where both in the religious communities and in the ultra-Orthodox communities, as Haredi women and religious women gain more status in the community through the professions, through education, where their role in their family changes, the leadership is nervous, and it kind of tightens the belt, as I'm translating from Hebrew. I'm not sure it's an idiom in English, but it introduces more rigid constraints about modesty. It should start from a younger age. It should be, if in the past weddings were segregated at the stage of the dancing in the Haredi community, today segregation starts from the entrance. There are two entrances for men and women. The age of education where segregation starts is literally 3. You don't have Coed education, etc., etc. One final introduction is that I insist on my position of critiquing a lot of the elements of the Haredi society with regard to women and of the unworthy tolerance of Israeli society towards this kind of segregation. But I am at the same time very worried about racist and anti-Semitic sensibilities in Israel against Haredim, and this is a poster from the height of the corona. We had a lot of issues. This is a topic for another presentation on how the Haredim dealt with the governmental orders, but that's to say it's about respectful differences, nothing else. So let me put an analytical distinction on the table. And the analytical distinction is that when we talk about women's exclusion or segregation, we should differentiate between 3 situations. This is situation number 1. We have an activity which is in the circle to which men can enter, but women are excluded from. Situation number 2 is where both sexes are allowed into the activity, let's say to a bus or to a concert or to an academic program, but conditions for men are better than conditions for women. So it's not symmetrical. It's separation without equality, with discrimination. And finally, we have situations that, as I will show you, are merely hypothetical, but that's where all the debate goes to, which are sex segregation in completely equal conditions, equal space, equal budget, equal prestige for men and for women. So let me illustrate what I mean. I'll give you a few examples for each of those types of activities. So this is an example of men taking over natural springs. It happens in the area of Jerusalem, and in the north, they announce that it's a mikveh for men, and they simply, by use of force, illegally ban women's usage of those water resources, which, as you know, in Israel is a very scarce and rare issue. We have new Haredi radio station from a few years ago. In order to differentiate itself from the competing, more veteran station, it announces that in this station, women's voices will not be heard. We're not talking about singing. We're talking about any voice of a woman in a precedent-setting class action. This practice has stopped, and the interesting thing for us here is that the argument of the station was that this was the infringement of its core religious rights of the community, but once the court ruled that it's illegal, they are complying. Women in Israel, not only in Haredi neighborhoods, are required to be modest. Here is an example of a case that was ruled recently and is now under appeal, of a young woman who simply was not allowed on the bus because her shorts were too short, and the driver thought that she wasn't modest enough for the passengers in the bus. A COVID-19 patient was not evacuated because she had a tank top, another case that is being litigated now. If you are a coach of a youth basketball team or soccer or whatever, and you want your team to participate in the national tournaments, you have to sign the national regulations according to which, if your team is Coed, and it plays against Elitzur, which is the religious boys teams. You are promising to leave the girls on the bench, so they don't participate. So think about it in terms of a Title IX in the US, it's kind of unthinkable. This happens also for older women. This woman is a basketball fan. She started a group in her country club, but when one of the participants announced that he starts to be Shomer Negiah, he is stronger in his faith and he doesn't want to touch women, the country club told her, you have to leave the group that you founded. In the Knesset, it already happened twice that reached the newspapers. It maybe happened more than that. The Knesset accommodated the request of Haredi Knesset members to remove women so that they don't sit adjacently to women. And again, this is a new practice. It was never a problem in the first 7 decades of Israel. In one of the frequent election cycles that we have been having, I hope this is going to stop for a few years, the Rebbe from Ger, his entourage kicked the woman out of the ballot team because the Rebbe does not enter a room with women. So you see that women, even in the political sphere, are becoming an interruption in the order, a contamination, something that the eye and the eye and the body can't tolerate. This also happens with a young age. The state accommodates, even during the COVID, Zoom recreational classes for kids at the ages of 8 to 11. And of course, this is not like what the picture shows, for boys only. So a lot of the budgets often go to boys alone. We had a really nice reform in Israel where finally we had 2 poets, Rachel the poet and Leah Goldberg, on money bills. And this is what they look like when they circulate in Haredi areas. Girls' faces are vandalized in wherever they're shown. You don't even have to be, it's not a matter of modesty. As you can see here, this woman is very righteous and modest and covered, but her face is still intolerable. And it's also not a matter of age. We can be amused and laugh to say that at least this sort of sexism is not ageist, because you can be tempting at whatever age, and yet. Saluting the Hadassah medical staff, but not the women, it's intolerable, etc., etc. Even the Smurfs, when they are published in Bnei Brak, the Smurfette is airbrushed out. And it's important to note here, which is a very big part of the story for me, that unlike our assumption that, oh, those crazy Bnei Brak people that can't even see an animated female figure, this wasn't the story here. I actually went and looked what happened there. And in fact, it was an initiative of the distribution company of the film, of the ad company. It was not a taboo from the Bnei Brak city or from the ad agency. And we often see this kind of, oh, let's accommodate them even more than they need because we don't want to get into trouble. And we have liberal people that feel that they're feminists in every other context, but when it comes to dealing with people that they think, oh, they can't tolerate women, then they go further than what is needed. This is the picture from the government when we had stability in 2015. You can compare the picture on the right to the picture on the left and see who's missing. There's no trace of female presence in the picture on the left. The three female ministers are simply not there. This is how it was published in one of the Haredi newspapers. And that's not what I wanted to show. Okay, I'll go remind me this photo later. I'll tell you why I had it there. But what I showed you until now is this kind of, sorry. Look at this, the diagram on the top left. It's activities where women simply are excluded from. They do not participate. And now I'm going to move to the second kind of harm to women, which is, okay, you're welcome to enter, but you'll be at the back. This is a photo from the southern city of Netivot. This is where the photo is from the perspective of the women's section in the event. So you see that they're far, they're in the side, they hardly can see the stage. Cemeteries, funerals in Israel, there are some Chevra Kadisha burial services that are run by Orthodox staff that decide that women should be at the back of the funeral, or they should avoid from giving a eulogy. Again, there is no halachic basis to this type of format of a funeral. So here I'm going back to the 2015 photo of the government. In the 2021 representation of the government, we see some improvement because we don't see the faces of the women, but we do see their names, okay? So the black figures that you see them are of the female ministers, but it's not complete exclusion of their trace of their existence, but just not showing their name. This is, by the way, some kind of resistance counterculture where somebody illustrated what it would feel like when the opposite would have been done. So here we have only the women's faces showing and the men's faces not showing. And this is a response to the voices in Israel saying, what do you want from them? Let them be themselves. This is their culture. What do you care about how politicians are portrayed in the Haredi newspapers? And I think this is a very good illustration of what kind of harm is caused to the dignity and to the political participation of every politician, even when they're presented to the Haredi community. And somebody even went further and did it to the Haredi leadership of Yahadut HaTorah, of Agudat Israel. So that's again kind of a counterculture example. Knesset members who show up with, in Israel, we're not very formal, as you know, but this is a nice designer dress in my feeling. But if you have no sleeves, then you are scolded as not appropriate for the membership in the Knesset. And this is an example of a newspaper or a news venue, online news venue is Haredi Kikar Shabbat, that does show also the women, which goes to show you that it's not about halakha, it's not about a ban, it's about cultural standards. We move to spatial segregation, and here we have a very common phenomenon in the city of Bet Shemesh that's been litigated a lot, as you can see, women are supposed to go on the left-hand side of the staircase and men on the right. But here I want to share with you my dilemma as a scholar in conceptualizing this. Because if we think of the left-hand picture that I showed you before, it's about segregation, right? There is equal space to each sex, okay? Women on the left, men on the right, great. But what you don't see here is the little signs on the bars between the staircase that say, like in the middle picture here, passage is permitted only with modest dress. And that is, of course, relevant for the women. So the women's conditions are worse than the men. And you have many other signs which call for modesty for the women, or for women to completely avoid using certain parts of the street, like in the picture on the right. So the analysis is often murky. Okay, here we go to academic studies. And I have to say that the programs of and the idea of integrating Haredi students into academia is a good idea. It's an important idea. It has many, many important achievements in my mind. And the question that I have and that I posited to the Supreme Court is whether this is the least harmful means to women's equality, i.e., don't we have other measures by which we should first try to integrate Haredim into academia, other than what the Council for Higher Education in Israel did in 2012? It asked the academic institutions to open programs, special programs for ultra-Orthodox students, and it defined that those programs should be in conditions of sex segregation. So women will study in some classes and men will study in other classes. When the Council of Higher Education did it, it accompanied it with a lot of subsidies and financial incentives for the institutions that do it. The institution mentioned in this slide and in other slides is a private institution, so it's not part of the game, and you will hear from the distinguished Professor Tova Hartman, who comes from ONO, in a couple of weeks. But the rest of what I'm going to say applies to, apart from the subsidy part, applies to all of those institutions. The notion, the idea was that this temporary segregation will be a means for assimilation, for inclusion. So the designers of the program have never imagined what we see today, short 9 years after these programs started. And what we see is that unlike the promises of the designers of those programs for Haredim, segregation in academic studies expands to second degrees, to master's degrees, and there is demand for more and more master's degrees. It infringes on the right of female professors, so their equal opportunity is harmed. They're not allowed to teach in the classes of the men and become less productive, less useful for the institutions. The criteria for who is allowed to be admitted to those programs, which used to be very strictly limited to Haredi students, is now very, very open-ended. You can be religious, you can be someone in between the religious and Haredi. We have a term in Israel, Hardalim. And the segregation is very strict, and it runs much more widely than within the classroom itself. It is now expanded so that it's either a temporal division, so women are in some days and men study in other days, or the campuses are completely segregated. And we have stories, including from Bar Ilan, media exposures, where the men, until the men leave the building, the women are required to wait in a waiting room so that they don't mix, they don't, challenge anyone in their presence. There are phenomena such as modesty supervision. If you come without socks, or if you come with a scooter helmet as a woman, you are disciplined and you can't continue your studies. I don't think this belongs to academia. This photo, has been distributed to the media. It's from a very highly covered visit of a former Supreme Court Justice, the esteemed Ron Barak, in the Ono Law School. It has been, to some degree, rightfully so, presented as an achievement, because there is a lot of resistance and antagonism towards the Supreme Court, and for these students to listen to Barak, who is irresistibly charming and a mensch, is a big achievement. On the other hand, you can see the asymmetry in this picture, and there are debates about it. Afterwards, the Ono management said, no, this picture distorts it. It's not that the women didn't see the stage like the men. So this is why I put it, I'm cautious. I think it's the diagram on the top left, so women don't have equal conditions, but it might be a symmetrical divide. My argument is that even if the separate are symmetrical, they get equal conditions, it is still discrimination to mark somebody's sex when this sex is irrelevant for the activity. This reinforces essentialist notions that we have managed to do away with in our modern constitutions and kind of enlightened humanist revolution. Israel is becoming a country where more and more social, economical, political spaces notice one's sex, and sex becomes a relevant question to where you can stand, whether you can enter, whether you can speak and participate, etc. Another example of this kind of asymmetry in segregation. Another aspect of the discrimination is that women are not offered the same classes as men are offered. Typically, they are offered pink-collar jobs with lower status and lower income. And again, it's this kind of puzzling, I think, I'll say it's gently, lack of wisdom for the government and for policymakers in academia, on the one hand, to try and integrate women into science and technology professions, and on the other hand, when it comes to Haredi, to say, no, it's a matter of supply and demand, and we're not responsible, and women can be, offered different programs, and we're fine with this. So to conclude this part, and I'm nearing the end of my talk, Uri, don't worry. The bottom left diagram here of equal separation with a gray arrow is what the Israeli public thinks is the question. They think the question is, what do we care about sex segregation under equal conditions when it happens within the Haredi communities? It's not our business, it's about multiculturalism, let it be. In fact, as I showed you, we have hardly any context in which the separate are equal. Even when this is stated, it just doesn't happen. And I think it goes to testify that it's a naivete, and it's this kind of playing it in straight face to think, oh, women and men are just separate, but their status is equal. In fact, women are not allowed to many of the spaces, or when they are allowed, they get worse off conditions. To illustrate, and I illustrated before, but I want to push the point further, how this kind of mentality affects Israeli women in general. Think of the doctors, the female gynecologists, and the female nurses in the Ichilov, the very esteemed hospital in Tel Aviv, in their maternity department. In this publicity to Haredi women who give birth, women doctors, women nurses are simply absent. They're not there. What does that mean for me as a professional woman in Israel? What does it mean symbolically for girls that women are expendable when you talk to the Haredi community? The ripple effects are huge. This is me, circa 1976. Today, had I been trying to go to school dressed this way, they would have kicked me out because this is immodest. There is too much flesh in this picture. And this has become an issue in secular liberal schools in Israel. Girls are sent home because their shorts are too short. The way we conceive, all of us in Israel, female propriety has been changing, and I have to emphasize this has nothing to do with the question of the school uniform, yes or no. It's a different question. It's about an unequal standard of modesty for girls. This is my dear colleague and friend, Professor Ruth Halperin Kadari, which I'm sure Uri will try to invite at some point to speak on her issues of family law. And the reason she is here is because of her middle sticker on her laptop. The sticker says, Shivyon hu Shabbat shel Demokratia. Equality is the Shabbat of democracy. And this is what we have been arguing. We have been arguing that just as breaking the Shabbat is something that you do, violating the Shabbat is something that you do as a last resort, so it should be with equality. It should be the last means to achieve any goal whatsoever. Today in Israel, it's the first means that the policymakers go to. So from my point of view, accommodation is a beautiful concept that promotes equality, but it's a distortion of accommodation to accommodate one group and enhance its equality at the expense of another group's equality. It doesn't work. You know, equality is not a zero-sum game. You have to promote it for everyone. So going back to the case, there are, as I said, some achievements, i.e. the proportionality, the limitation on how the sex-segregated campuses can look like. The court said no more second degrees in segregation. There is no justification for it. It's not proportional. No more discriminating of the female professors. No more free admission to whoever wants to study in those programs. It should be restricted just for par excellence Haredim, and equal study programs, subjects to both sexes, and also the segregation should be maintained only in the classroom strictly, not elsewhere. Now, in 2 weeks, you'll hear from a colleague that I really respect, and she's not the only one to whom I believe that she wants to, when she advocates and puts her heart and time in educating Haredim, especially Haredi women, she is a representation of Tikkun Olam, just like my activity in my mind is an activity of Tikkun Olam. Our argument is not that it's important, and it's not that Haredi women should get the opportunity to study. And I also believe them when they say, hey, it's difficult for me to study in academia alongside men. I understand it, but I still think that there are alternatives, and that the issue, the argument that I'm not comfortable with it is not a good enough argument to introduce to the entire Israeli society the normalization of sex segregation. So I'm going to stop the share here, and thank you for your patience.
Dr. Tirosh, so we thank you, but you have kept us in suspense, because the first obvious question is, for those who listen to us from around the world, who may not know, what did the court decide?
Oh, I did say I thought, but I will say again. So the court said sex segregation in academic studies is harmful for equality and for human dignity, but it serves an important state interest. Hence, equality, like any other right, is not an absolute right. Let's check if it's a proportional harm to equality and to dignity. And it says, well, here are the conditions by which such programs would be proportional. Most of those conditions are not a reality right now in Israel. The academic system must realign itself quickly in order to comply with the court. And this is the list that I mentioned before: no discrimination for the female professors, no second degrees, etc., etc. But I have to say, when we think of what's next, what's going to happen from this case, let me first say that today, a few hours ago, we petitioned the High Court of Justice to review the case in a larger panel of justices. We have a low chance of getting our petition the agreement of the court, because the original panel was expanded from 3 to 5 justices, which is already a large panel in Israel. But we do hope at least to get, even if they deny our petition, we do hope to get a decision that is much more specific on the tachlis, as we say in English, the actual implications of the proportionality criteria in the case, which were a little bit murky, and you have to kind of use tweezers from each judge to pick and see what's going on in their opinion. But I also have to say that, unfortunately, in my perspective, if this decision doesn't, and I forgot to say, it was a rare decision these days in the sense that it was a 3-2. So there were 2 in the minority. Many decisions, precedent decisions in Israel today are almost uniformly, all the justices write the same to the same side and agree. And when the case is translated, I hope you read it, the dissent is really amazing in really saying brown type things, that this is harmful to equality, to mark women as a different and an interruption to the eyes. I'm speaking too much, but ask me about the implications. I'll let you ask me about
Well, there was another preliminary question. If you could once again restate your distinction between, or the distinction you feel is objective and universal, between sex and gender, and why is it that you repeatedly prefer using sex segregation rather than gender?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So I know that today gender has become kind of the politically correct term. Everybody uses it and they don't distinguish between sex and gender, but I think it's an analytical distinction that is important. When we talk about sex, at least in feminist theory, we refer, and there's a lot of debate about that, what is sex and what is sexual difference. I'm not going to get into it, but the convention is that we refer to the biological foundation. Do you have a uterus and vagina? Do you have a penis? Do you have X and Y chromosome or Y and Y chromosomes? This is what distinguishes between females and males, and that is sex. Gender is about femininity or masculinity. Are you do you perform, and are you socially perceived as feminine or as a woman that is conventional woman? No woman is conventionally feminine. We all are on a spectrum, but still there is a binary. Or are you masculine? Now, the signs and the rules when it comes to this type of segregation that I am talking about do not care if you're you experience yourself as feminine or as a woman. They care about biology. That's why they send the male to female transgender person to the male side of the Western Wall, okay? They don't care that she passes as a woman and that she feels like a woman. They look at the biology. So that's my explanation.
Now, there is a question that has to do with the larger picture that you painted for us. And the question is, are there other relevant cases in the pipeline that we should be, looking to see, read about? And maybe you can say a word about something that we had an exchange earlier today, which
Yes.
is really sort of in the gray as yet, and that is the use of public space, the use of public property for events that are sex segregated.
Yes, so yes, we are expected to see, not in the high court, more in lower courts, but it's going to influence the country all the same. We're expected to see rulings and petitions on issues such as the legality of professional training by the Civil Service Commissioner that is done in segregation. So again, in a way of accommodation, the Civil Service Commissioner in Israel a few years ago has attempted, has conducted a course for civil service cadets, so the future of the elite civil service, and it opened it to men only. A few months later, it opened another course to women. There were Haredi people, and there was this justification again that without segregation, the Haredim will not participate. After the 2 weeks ago's ruling, the recent ruling, we are expected, unfortunately, I think, to witness yet other attempts to start such professional training in segregation, and organizations like the Israel Women's Network or the Reform Center or other civil rights organizations in Israel are going to challenge that. We have pending cases on what Uri mentioned now, public events. So a case that is pending today is on an event for parents of children with learning disorders, how do you call HDD and all those dyslexia, etc., etc. It occurred in Jerusalem. A dear friend of mine who maybe you know her, some of you know her name. She was in Michigan for many years. Now she teaches in Bar Ilan. She's an amazing literary scholar. Her name is Ilana Bloomberg. She goes to this conference as a parent, and what she discovers is, and it's sponsored by the city of Jerusalem, okay, that women are sent to one side of, not to one side of the room, to different rooms. Men, the fathers are sent to another side, and the speakers in the men's side, the professionals that lecture are only male professionals, and in the mother's side, it's male and female professionals. So if you're an expert in learning disabilities and you're a woman, you are excluded to the female side. The same goes with public concerts. So Uri has gathered heroically many ads from the Haredi website and newspapers from recent weeks, where some of them are for men alone. Others are clearly admitting women, but put them in a special remote section. And yet others are not specific, and they at least presumably provide equal conditions to men and women. My position is that even with the symmetrical division between men and women, even if they're equal distance from the stage, same price of a ticket, etc., this is an activity, especially when it's publicly sponsored by public authorities that when the state permits it or a municipality permits it, it itself discriminates. It conditions participation in this activity according to one's sex. The rhetoric on the other side is, what do you want? Let us enjoy some culture. Culture is not only for secular people, etc., etc. And I understand that sentiment, but I think it should remain the self-seating can be voluntarily segregated. It cannot be by signs or by conductors or dictated by anybody from the outside. But I'm kind of lonely, and not just me, I have many allies, but this is not a popular sentiment in Israel, I have to say.
So something that is much more popular, and I want to mention, to sort of put in a plug, is something that Chidush has been working on for quite a number of years, and we currently represent the Israel Women's Network and the Naamat, and the Reckman Center as well, and another women's rights organization. And that is the demand for equal participation in the religious councils of Israel, which are administrative bodies throughout the country that for years have been excluding women, and then a landmark Supreme Court ruling prohibited excluding women, and still women weren't appointed. And we are now at a very progressive stage after having obtained instructions from the Attorney General that there should be at least 30% women appointed as to the panels that constitute the religious councils, and that women should be appointed to senior position on an affirmative action basis. So this is the...
Sorry. This is a wonderful example. What happens in the religious council is an amazing example, of the different sentiment in Israel 30 years ago, when the first decision, the Supreme Court decision in the early 90s was given that women are allowed to serve in a religious councils. There's no religious ban on this, and the person who wrote this decision is an esteemed scholar, religious scholar of Jewish law, late Justice Menachem Eilon, and he was kind of courageous and clear. There is the law of the land. The law of the land is about sex equality. And he told the rabbinate that threatened, the rabbinate said, we will not collaborate with any religious council that has a woman on it. And he said, tough, you'll have to live with it. Sorry, we're not going to surrender to your threats. Unfortunately, this kind of clear vision is a little bit missing, I feel, from Israel's Supreme Court these days. And I say it with the utmost respect and with sadness. This is not about the voices from the right that try to attack the court as illegitimate and as the activist, etc., etc. I completely support the rule of law, but I don't think that's not a reason to critique when there is room to critique. And what we see today is indeed that religion, even in the very religious towns, it's a reality that, the sky didn't fall when women participate. It took some time, but the sky didn't fall when women became more and more members of the religious councils. And that's my sense with academia. It would have taken a little bit more time, maybe, for the ultra-Orthodox to join academic studies. What I haven't said is that for religious men, the biggest issue is that they are exempt, that the government is cowardly giving them exemption from core curriculum. These people, the Haredi people in their schools, have maybe 8th grade general knowledge. They don't have English, they don't have math, they don't have biology, they don't have geography. That is the problem. And also the taboo against academic studies in their societies. There are other issues that hamper their success in academic studies. It's not about sex segregation as a quick fix.
Well, we
yeah.
hosted
Oh,
Professor Duncan David here a couple of months ago, and of course the issue of the dire impact of the lack of co-curricular studies on Israeli economy and on the future of Israel has been sort of drilled in this webinar and demonstrated in a very compelling way.
Excellent. So I'll answer Danielle's question on the chat. And the question is, wouldn't education separation lead to workplace segregation? This is my question as well. I have to say that from the Haredi perspective, the experience is genuine. I believe the Haredim that tell me, look, you just don't understand. This is an inherent distinction in our culture. Studies is one thing, and there are halachas about when you gather and you, for example, in studies, you have to do it in segregation. But when you're in the workplace, you're busy working, so it's not the same. What I see, however, as I showed you, de facto is that segregation, rather than being a temporary means that would lead to assimilation, becomes a means for yet more segregation. We now have sex-segregated preventative driving classes. In Israel, if you get too many driving violation reports, you have to take a state course that will remind you how to be a careful driver, as much as Israelis can be careful drivers. And the Ministry of Transportation started providing such courses to men alone. Okay, for Haredi men. We have it in places that you wouldn't imagine. We now have another issue that's in the pipeline, as we said before, which is the authority that manages many of the natural parks and resorts in Israel wants to open those parks partially in segregated hours. So hours for men to go to the natural springs and hours for women. And we see it becoming, as I said before, normalized. Now, again, I want to emphasize the hardest point for me in this, it has been a very, very demanding journey. This whole petition that has been run for 8 years and hasn't stopped. I invested much more of my time and my energy and my emotional energy that I ever anticipated, and that my, let's say, my deans should know about. But it has cost me a lot. But the one issue that really is painful for me is to get the genuine self-report from Haredi women that tell me, look, without access to first degree in segregation, I would not have studied. I would not have had an academic education, either because it's uncomfortable for me. I've never done it before. I've never sat with a man in a class. It's too much for me. I wouldn't speak up in a Coed classroom, or because my rabbi and my husband and my father would not have allowed it. I respect that. I understand it, and it saddens me. But what I see is that then a few years later, they come and they say, look, you can't stop our second degree in segregation. You have to let us study separately in a second degree. And today we have absurd situations that are really, it's beyond my ability to fathom, where a male Haredi student studies social work. First degree, men only in the class, doesn't see female student, doesn't see female professor, doesn't see secular students, doesn't see Arab students, doesn't see students out of the closet. It's very homogeneous. He only studies social work with male Haredi students. And then he moves on to the second degree, and he also studies only with male Haredi students. Yes, there is an internship, so maybe there he mixes a little bit, but think of what he does later when he becomes a social worker. Let's say, a hypothetical, it doesn't happen in real life, that he only admits male clients, okay, or male patients. And the person in front of him says, my wife doesn't understand me. How can he provide any sort of counseling when he did not have exposure his whole life from first grade to the second degree to women in his everyday proximity? It's just completely inconceivable. This is not the Israel that we've all learned to appreciate and be proud of, the Israel of Golda Meir and of Hannah Stanesh and of Nobel laureate Ada Yonat and of 3 Supreme Court presidents that are women. It's becoming quickly a very, very different type of society.
Well, I think these are great words to end with. Clearly, the question that you raised is a question that we will present to Professor Tova Hartman. And it'll be interesting to see how she reconciles the desire to open up academic programs to both Haredi women and Arab women. And at the same time, how does she see them integrate into the workplace in which the challenges they'll be confronting will not be part of their toolkit, so to speak, or if they are, they'll be an abstract toolkit and not a genuine immersion that is necessary for professional success. So, first of all, I want to thank you. It's been a wonderful presentation that I think gave our participants from wherever they are an understanding of an area of Israeli life that is not very often spoken about. And if it's spoken about, it's presented as sort of a particular headline, a scandal, and not as sort of an integral element that is tied to many other aspects of Israeli life and is frankly quite unique to Israel and some fundamentalist religious other countries, but certainly is not part and parcel of the everyday life of most of our or all of our participants. So thank you for enlightening us on this issue. It's not going to go away. Both issues in the pipeline and issues that we may not still know that they are in the pipeline, but will be coming along. I hope everybody will be joining us for the next session in 2 weeks. I want to thank Jofa for joining with us and co-sponsoring these sessions that I hope are enriching your understanding of some of the challenges that women face in Israel. And of course, our ongoing co-sponsors, the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, Ruach Hidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality in Israel, and the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network. Toda, Shalom, good evening from Jerusalem, good morning, good noon from wherever you are, and lehitraot, looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. And thank you again, Dr. Tirosh.